I could quite happily sit here in conversation with Andrew Robb to talk about the Liberal Party, because that was how I first came across Andrew all those years ago when he was first elected to Parliament. But look, Andrew, it's a pleasure to have you here. As Ben said, thank you very much. It's topical that we're talking about trade, amongst many other things. And so I wanted to start out today by asking, how does the son of a dairy farmer from what was once the outskirts of Melbourne become one of Australia's fiercest advocates for free trade?
That's a good question. Could I just thank Ben for the introduction and for you to, and, just be easy on me. No, that was a pleasure to get the invitation, and I've always been, one way or another, a maintainer involvement in agriculture. I'm on the board of Gina Reinhardt's or cattle interests, have been for several years since I left the Parliament, along with a lot of other different things. But that's where my true love lies. And excuse, I've had the morning from hell. I won't bore you with it, but at the same time, I just ruined a 3-month-old suit. I've got holes in the 2 knees. So if you think Andrew's looking a bit ragged, then things aren't going so well. It's not all that bad, right? Now, free trade. Well, I suppose it was university where I got it. I got a lot of my values from my parents, and so personal responsibility. I was one of 9 kids, so you sort of had to take responsibility for all sorts of things. But it was a happy childhood. But they were they were a product of the war and all the rest of it, and they wanted education for all their kids. And so that was their biggest message: get educated. So I ended up, I did a diploma of ag science, and in that course I discovered economics, and then I went and did straight eco degree. So I'm in the economics degree, and there was a guy, Laszlo Zappo. He taught a subject. I was doing it at night, right? And I'm working as an animal health officer during the day, and so I'm looking for subjects that I thought I could do easily. So there's this thing called comparative economic systems, and I thought that might be too hard. And it wasn't, but it just, it changed my life, really. Laszlo had a product of the revolution in Hungary in 1956, and he was so passionate about the impact of economic systems on people's lives and outcomes, whole communities. And we spent the whole semester looking at examples, and like East and West Germany. At that stage, we're talking in the early 70s, it wasn't that long that they'd been split. But already in the early 70s, you had a state that was going gangbusters, West Germany, and you had a country that was just going further and further into the mire, and it just got worse and worse, obviously. But he drew the whole semester. I couldn't believe how many such situations, both common today situations like in Ireland and other places, but also historically, not that far back, but over the previous 100 years, but endless examples which were so clear-cut, where you had economies that were open, people did well. Where you had economies that were closed, they did badly. And even China, I'm now a real student of China because of the work that I've done there, and I'm still doing a serious amount of work in China. But for 18 of the last 20 centuries, they've been at the centre of gravity with other countries at different times of world economics and trade and all the rest of it. But in the 15th century, they opened up, and that was the Silk Road. It wasn't just one Silk Road, there were dozens of Silk Road. And they opened up, and they were the absolute leaders in the world. And there's so much progress in that under that regime. Then they closed, and missed the Industrial Revolution. And then, China, that big country, was getting invaded by those great big countries like Portugal. I mean, so it was always that sort of experience. I learnt where you opened up, it was that's where you grew, and And I look from the last 70 years, and it's why I'm so frustrated with Trump at the moment. It's so regressive. You look at the last 70 years, the architecture of the United States basically introduced and led, with the help of a lot of others, to open up and trade and follow comparative advantage in terms of how you deal with one another. It has basically resulted in billions coming out of poverty in that 70 years. I mean, the classic is China, because they would never have done what they've done without getting into the WTO in 2001, and it was the United States. They wouldn't have got in if the US hadn't, facilitated it, made it happen. And then, 800 million out of poverty there, but there's been billions. And the growth, and I think a lot of it is the millions of supply chains from little operator here to a little operator there, and they get to know one another. And, someone in Cambodia, they're not bad people. They got the same ambition we've got, and now we're doing some business, right? And you put millions of these supply chains together, and it also underpins, real prospects for peace. So I'm so committed to the opening up, and that's why I was so pleased when I got that trade job, because of that, it gave me, I felt I'd been training for it for 30 years, to be honest, and I walked into it straight away knowing what I wanted to do, and and Laszlo started it.
Good old Laszlo. Look, I'm going to jump ahead on my notes to pick up on what you said about Donald Trump. And, it's the art of the deal. Some of them are calling it. It's, it's a bit interesting. But you recently described the US decision as one driven by revenge, entitlement, coercion, and economic destruction. Where do you see it ending?
I don't know. I mean, it's already a process of coercion and destruction, and there's so much uncertainty. I think it even affected the result here in the election. I think Labor were always going to win, because I don't think the Libs, and they demonstrated, the coalition, that they weren't ready. But I think the first 10 days of the campaign was when he went on his rampage. 185 countries he put a tariff in, right? And then he did all the rest, and then he doubled down. It started with 60, and then he doubled down to 145 on China. Now, that was all in 10 days. That was the first 2 weeks of the campaign here. I think so many people in Australia thought, my God, where's this going to end? What's all this mean? Is this... And when you get something enormous uncertainty, you stay with the devil you know rather than the devil you don't. Even though, and this is polling, it's not just a biased sort of view, even though 60% of the population thought Labor deserved to be removed, their assessment was, well, I'm not sure the other mob will do any better. But secondly, in all this uncertainty, I don't need any more uncertainty in my life. I don't need a different government. I'll stay with them. And Albanese helped that, because I thought his personal campaign, was reassuring, and all the rest of it, and it fitted that climate. So, I think the problem is, who knows? Is this a sort of short-term strategy? It's so ham-fisted, in my view. I think a lot of it is directed, in the end, at China. I think the rest of it, maybe it's a sort of ploy to raise a bit of money, because they've got a huge debt, and he complains about the deficit, but from my analysis, I'm a macroeconomist, and I maintain a strong interest all my life in what's happening in a macro sense. They've got the US dollar. Having the dollar has meant that there's been, over many decades, billions of dollars that we're all putting in one way or another, either through our super funds or whatever, into the US, because it's a safe, and if there's a problem, it floods in to the US, because the dollar, people feel that the value of their money is maintained better than anywhere else, right? What do they do with all those billions? what have they done with all those billions? They've spent it elsewhere in the world. They spend our money, which I don't care. It's not a problem. They can do what they like with it. But don't come crying about it. That's what he's doing. They've spent the money, and as a consequence, that is what created the deficit. Not some, China, there's some issues there, but they're not world-shattering in my point of view. The America has benefited so much from 20 years of China opening up. How many of their big countries went in there and took advantage of cheap labour, But how many, the whole West, we all patted ourselves on the back as politicians saying we've kept inflation under control for 20 years. Well, no, we didn't. China, in opening up, had millions, hundreds of millions of people moving into the cities at low labour rates, and they created all that product at cheap rates. And many industries, especially from America, went in there and took advantage of it. So the world was awash with cheaper commodities than they would have been. And that led to 20 years of low inflation, right? So the story he's telling is crap. And he's full of it. He is so full of it. And his motivations, what bothers me is that the benefits he and his family seem to be accruing on the way through. And no one's, if I go into Southeast Asia, and I have done for 20 years, and I still do, I'm working a lot in Vietnam and Indonesia and India and still China, if there's anything happens, someone takes a long lunch, you end up seeing corruption on the front page, He gets an aeroplane worth $200 million and they say, good man, that was smart.
Tony Wright had an interesting piece in the Sydney Morning Herald about the plane and Paul Keating this morning, so it's worth a read. But
he's a great writer. I will try and catch up with it.
Do you think free trade can survive without the United States being the bulwark that it's been for the best part of the last 80 years?
I think it can. It won't be easy. The trouble is...
Who leads it? Who takes on that role, do you think?
India's... they are opening up just like the Southeast. The interesting thing is, for the first time in history, the Southeast Asian countries, I think they've watched China, what happened there in the first 20 years. They have now, for several years now, but people didn't realise what was happening, but a number of them did the TPP, and they really did it just so they could, like Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and all these, and Chile and Peru, they really joined the TPP because they wanted the credibility of doing a deal with the United States. Well, lo and behold, we'd all signed it, finished it, signed it. It just had to go through parliaments. And Trump, of course, first thing he did when the first time he was in president, he scrapped it, and with a lot of publicity. But what they've found, like Vietnam and places, so they were sort of, oh my God, because they had to go a lot further than everyone else in terms of agree, because that TPP is still, because there's been nothing since, that is still the most open and ambitious and free trade policy in the world, right? And it applies to 12 countries, and the UK have actually joined it since. But what's happened is Vietnam found that there's billions of dollars starting to come into Vietnam because people didn't want to take the risk with Trump, and they thought they got too much in China, so they wanted to diversify. And not just Vietnam, but those Indonesia, you go to Vietnam today, it's like 15 years, you swear you're 15 years ago in China. They're jumping out of their skin, they're all doing deals, they've got money and all that sort of stuff. And so there's 700 million people, right? You put them together, they're our second biggest trading partner. You put them together, they're China's biggest trading partner. Trump is pushing them into China. How stupid is that? He's really trying to, I think, stay. The US, their primary motivation is to stay number one. And I've been to the US every year since '81. I got friends on both sides of the chamber. Since 2010, I couldn't believe it. They've been talking, but in your face. Not usually you could go there and you'd have debates about all sorts of policy issues and everything every year. And it was, it was stimulating, and they were They were really front foot sort of people. But since about 2010, both sides, it's like a unity ticket, which I never had found on any issue there. The Republican Democrats, they're prone to disagreeing on most things. But on that issue, and it was like they had a page of speaking notes, and they'd be, you raise China in any way, and they're in your face. You know, it's like when someone comes up and is about 4 inches from you and is almost yelling at you. There's no scope for the discussion, right? And it's all containment. They've spent 15 years preaching containment, and I think Trump, he's on that issue, it's a unity ticket with all the political people in the US. And my conclusion, because for a long time I couldn't understand why, and in the end I decided there's no reason other than they want to stay number one, and this is why I think he's doubling down on them. The trouble is they're balkanising the world. There's so many areas, especially all of the new tech, where the US systems, you either use them, if you either don't use China or you won't get access. And the same with China's doing the same. So we're going to end up, and now that's to the detriment of I talked about all those millions of supply chains. That'll cut them in half.
Turning back to Australia for a moment, we've seen over the years, I know you're very fond of, I've heard you say this before, that through foreign investment, foreign investors can't dig it up and take it home with them in terms of investing in Australian agriculture and other sorts of things. Trade and investment clearly go hand in hand is what you're saying. How you see the Australian domestic landscape around some of those questions that face agriculture around where investment comes from is going to help diversify Australia's trade exposure to ensure that we don't end up with a situation like we had with China post-COVID, where a market door was closed and suddenly producers were kind of left reeling?
Well, it's FIRB is getting its worse, I'm afraid. And when I look at the composition, back in my time, it's 7 years now, I think, since I finished. But in my time, I was on the National Security Committee because I had the investment portfolio. It wasn't trade. Half my time was on investment and big investments, multi-billion-dollar investments. And what I was witnessing was that they were going down at that level. And the trouble is that the 5 most senior people in the government, they're the ones giving advice on different investments, right? And if the 5 most senior walk back into cabinet with a decision, who's going to oppose it? and their only advice at the time. So I went to see Abbott and said, mate, I'm travelling. I'm the only senior minister, I'm the only cabinet minister that's talking to anyone in the world, business, right? And I've got to be on that committee at least for those issues. So he put me on, and I stopped at least 7 deals over $1 billion. Some of them were $5 billion, which the spooks were saying there's security issues here. When there weren't, and they were holding back information, because I would get on the plane and go to Singapore. I'd go to China. I had to go to Spain. Spain is a big threat to us, as you know. I tell you, if I took you through that story, you'd just be open-mouthed. It was unbelievable. And it was a $3 billion deal, which was going south. It took me 5 minutes in a lounge room, 8:30 on a Saturday night in Madrid with the CEO to solve the problem. I ring Abbott. Monday morning, the whole deal's fixed and done before they even got back to the committee. It was going to go down on the Tuesday, right? And this is sort of nonsense that I discovered. And the thing was, I always ask when I see these CEOs in different parts of the world to check what the real facts were. I'd always finish up by saying, what did FIRB say to you when they talked to you? You're the CEO. This is a multi-billion-dollar deal, no doubt that. And every time, right, those 6 or 7 that I had a material impact on, every time they said, I never heard. No one's ever talked to me, right? No one from defence, security, or FIRB has talked to me. It's all on desktop, and I don't. And now they've actually got quite a solid group, with backgrounds in gas and all sorts of. Actually, I know half of them. One's the former ambassador. He's chairman. When I did the free trade agreement with Japan, he's a very good, open mind sort of fellow. So I think the board looks like you'd want to see because they've got commercial. That's the point. It's a foreign investment. It's investment. It's not foreign security. It's investment. And sure, they should be advised by security. But I'm not sure who the next layer is because so much stuff's being held up. And sometimes, I better not name names, but there's some very...
Andrew's got his pen poised over.
No.
If you...
Some very powerful journalists in this room at the moment. But I know of one where, there's a Chinese investor who's only a minor part of a whole lot of different investments in agriculture, and there's just another routine one occurring 9 months and it hasn't been approved. I mean, and yet for 8 years, there have been a lot of other deals in the same space, same sort of thing. Right, so I think I've probably forgotten what you asked, but I then...
Well, let's... So I want to give a chance to some others to ask some questions as well, but I've got two more. The Europeans are now apparently back interested in negotiating a deal with us. And the Prime Minister has made statements to the effect that he's not going to sell Australian agriculture down the river just to get it done. And we've seen fits and starts. I'm sure you experienced some when you were Trade Minister with the Europeans were keen and then not so keen. Do you think has Trump now forced that a change in attitude amongst some of the places where we've tried to do agreements in the past and not been successful?
I think that's true. I mean, you ask, who's going to lead the charge on? Well, I think there's a potential for Southeast Asia and India. I mean, India will be the third biggest economy in 10 years' time. They're the fifth at the moment. They are opening up in a serious way, right? It's taken a lot. Modi is an unbelievable man, and he has driven it. And, I've had personally, I went there 12 times in my time as Trade Minister, and I didn't finish it, but they kept at it, and he kept at it, and he was material right to the end in making sure it happened. And so they'll be forced to be reckoned with, and we should be aligning ourselves with. Southeast Asia is more our political territory, in my view. We'll have no influence on. We don't now, never have, with the US and China. I mean, we've had friendships and we need a good working relationship with both. But if they balkanise, this is going to be really hard. And that's, I think there's balkanisation. If all of a sudden you've got all the rules and regs and all that, you're not getting any harmonisation, across. And China is so far ahead of the world. People don't realise. I could take you through something. I'll give you one example. Sorry, I'll get back to your question. But
you're a former politician. You don't have to answer.
No, I'm quite. No. Yeah, just hold that question because this is quite. I was there a couple of weeks ago. I'm involved with a project, $17 billion project, privately funded project to put a container port into Gladstone. It's the fourth biggest coal port in the world, second biggest coal seam zip on containers. It's the middle of a cattle industry. Hundreds of deep B-doubles go past Gladstone every week, 600 kilometres down to a congested port in Queensland, in Brisbane, and come back possibly 5 days later past Gladstone. It's just, there's so much horticulture now going. Anyway, the North, I've been a passion to develop the North 40 years, and this is a project that will make a very material difference. But in the course, I'm looking at the best technology to run the port, the best technology to do the logistics and the operations. The fourth biggest logistics company in the world is a company called SF Express. They're the biggest in Asia, mainly China. They got 80 planes, all the rest. They're just a monster, right? And they're unbelievably. They got hundreds of people. They employ 150,000. They got hundreds in R&D. So they've developed all their own drones. So in Shenzhen a few weeks ago, we go out to their facility at the airport. Hardly saw anybody because it's all automatic. 850,000 parcels that day through that one facility. and hardly anyone there, right? Then we come back into town, and they said, come around the corner, and a drone lands, and they open up the front of it, and there's a basket in there of about 40 parcels, right? And I said, where did this come from? They said, because there's all these lakes in Shenzhen. Over that, some lake, and 16 minutes, if we put it in a truck, an hour and a half. And I said, how much are these? How often is this happening? He said, oh, well, in Shenzhen, we'll do about 12 to 1,500 of these drone deliveries today. And then I asked about the regs, because we always think China's got no regulations, it's all just cowboy land, really. It's not, they're not, in all of the new stuff, in the EVs and all this stuff, they're so far ahead of us. But on this drone stuff, they had spent, a good 9 months. But we'd spent 4 years. They spent 9 months, but they identified, some passageway above the highest area that helicopters could go, but below the lowest area that aeroplanes could go. A whole lot of other issues which they negotiated. Now, and I said, okay, so you think you're extending this to other? They said, well. Yeah, we're now in 20 cities in China. And so today, about 40,000 drone deliveries will occur in China in highly populated cities. They've never had one incident. They've got the regulations pinned down. When this drone went back, I lost sight of it. That's how high up they found this passageway, which was suitable. So 40,000 drones a day. And then I met 2 days later a guy that had developed other drones. I said, where do you live? He couldn't speak English, but he said, in Brisbane, right? And he's got one drone carries four people, 40 kilometres, 4 adults, right? He had all these different, they all look different, they're all sizes and all that. Another one was for firefighting. Now, I fought a lot of fires when I was a young fella in the bush. I know about, where you would go and where you shouldn't go and all that. He had the visuals for this firefighting drone, and it went into places you couldn't put people, right? But to do all sorts of things, deliver or to seek to put out fire over a house or whatever you wanted to do. And I said, I said, what's happening with all these drones in Australia? He said, oh, CASA won't entertain it for a second. None of them, for any purpose at all. I said, what about the firefighting? Not at all. Honestly, this is where we're at. And we've got to stop assuming that China and Vietnam and Indonesia and India are all, historic and underdeveloped and have no. They are walking past us on so. Okay, they learned. They looked at what we were doing and they've done it. In agriculture, in China, some of the horticultural opportunities for vertical horticulture and other types of the technology is, and it's not just stuff for sort of one little application. It's for mass consumption, and then some of this stuff is we can't even conceive of it. We ought to damn well go and have a look, but also when we do the review of CHAFTA, it's been a great success. 98 billion turned into 330 billion a year in trade in the 10 years, notwithstanding we had some problems in the middle of it, right? That has worked a treat, and mainly because of the effectiveness of the Chinese-Australian diaspora, who have been the bridge on this thing. But next, we need a review because so much has happened in 10 years, and a lot of it should be harmonising regulations, and that's where we'll get enormous efficiency gains, and also we'll head off the balkanisation.
My final question, before I throw it to the floor, is in your, formerly CEO of the National Farmers Federation, we've now got a situation where we've got an agriculture advocacy sector which is a little bit fragmented, I think it's fair to say, and there's a little bit of concern about the makeup of the new parliament. What advice would you offer to the ag advocacy sector about ensuring that the ag sector continues to thrive under a government which many of them would perceive as being a risk to them?
That is the hardest question you give me all day. It's look, our problem our problem is that nearly 85% of our population, it's been our problem all along, no matter who's in government, right? But it's worse with Labor, only because their natural constituency is different to that of the coalition. I mean, they're all good and bad, right? But you know, I greatly admire what Hawke and Keating did, right? So I'm not being partisan here, but the thing is, 85% of our population, more or less, lives in 5 capital cities. Therefore, by definition, 85% of our politicians live in 5 capital cities. You know, I've spent 20 years with a bunch of other people trying to get a high-speed rail, not to get people faster from Melbourne to Sydney, but to create regional cities, right? And we got 16 million to get the best companies in the world, Hyundai and all these big ones who look at smart cities and to design what would be the right city, what you could do, you know, independent power, independent water, independent waste with existing technology. So imagine what it'll be like in 10 years' time. And what's the optimum size and how you would do it, not a truck above ground, all these sort of things consistent with, you know, the ambition for sustainability and you know, clean environments and all the rest of it. All this work was done, it's been presented, just gets put on the shelf because everyone says, you know, I take them around and say, look what we can do. We can have 5 cities of 500,000 between Melbourne and Sydney, much less going north. Same thing, you know. Great idea, Andrew. That is fantastic. You ought to keep talking about that. You know, you ought to get the momentum going on that. And, you know, I said, well, there's a proposal up in Cabinet. Keep it going, keep it going. Out comes the budget. Someone's put a new tunnel under their electorate in the cities. The money that could go regional. It's so difficult. This project that I'm involved in, putting a container port, and it makes all this sort of sense because it's a deep water and all the others are shallow. So the big containers in the world, they've got 22,000 containers on a ship. They can't go into our other ports, right? And they're not interested anyway because Australia's a bit of a nuisance from a shipping point of view. So we've always had, it's always been difficult, even though we rely 100% on it, right? But that, you know, that there's been lots of proposals to open up that whole region up to Gladstone, the central Queensland. But, you know, they haven't got a rail through some of the most powerful resource and energy basins, you know, hundreds of kilometres. There's not even a railway line through. And there's been endless proposals. They've all depended on a big component of government spending. And it never happens, even in Queensland, which can benefit so much from, it's 2,000 kilometres from Brisbane to the top of Queensland, right? So we're talking just 600-700, right? We're talking, the Rockies, the centre of cattle, the cattle industry. There's millions of cattle to start with. There's so much value-added stuff there. That's the 4th biggest coal port in the world, right? And so much value it is that, you know, there's a project I'm involved with, which is organic fertiliser, which is doing absolutely identical work with nitrogen and potash, but it has a big component of organic. And after a year or two, it does the equal job for a year or two, and then afterwards the organic stuff starts to really cut in and creates a microclimate, and away you go. Right now, this is the sort of thing you couldn't consider to produce, but what's the feedstock? Coal. There's an element in coal, which is the organic material, which is the best in the world for creating an organic substance to put. And we're a nation which got fragile soil, and we need organic matter. The more we put in, the better we go. Now, that would not happen if you haven't got a container port where you can export it. And so we've got all these opportunities which are now at our fingertips, but we wouldn't have it. This one's going to be privately funded, and it's been designed so we can do that in
So we get an inland rail up to Gladstone, is that what you're saying?
Well, it's not an inland rail. Well, it's a freight rail. a freight rail will join up with the inland to Melbourne, we will send in 25 hours, we will send a train load, double decker of containers, and we do dozens. We'll send millions from Gladstone down to Melbourne. If you'd send a container at the moment, if you're out of Gladstone somewhere, it's 170 hours to get to Melbourne, right? We'll do it in 26, and it will transform. It will fundamentally transform so much. All of our ports, they're all congested. Any growth in Australia on the East Coast, we've got nowhere to go with it, right?
Fascinating conversation. I'm wondering if there's any questions in the room.
Katie McGraw from the Australian Farm Institute. Andrew, you spoke about trading around Trump. I'm paraphrasing you a little bit there, but you know what I'm getting at here. AFI has just recently published some work doing a bit of economic modelling on the impacts of these tariffs, and we were pleasantly surprised, to see that not only was the potential impact on Australian agriculture minimal, in some cases it could potentially be positive in certain scenarios, and it's largely due to the exchange rate cushioning effect. So are we jumping at shadows? It takes a lot of our attention, these kinds of things. Everything's changing so fast. We're always worried about how somebody's suddenly not playing by the rules and it could impact this badly. Are we jumping at shadows? Are we actually in a good position here in Australia? And what can we do then to shore up the relationships that do benefit us?
Well, yeah, good question. Firstly, Trump's not the first one to, in the last few years, the West has been closing up. Progressively, there's been initiatives taken by Western countries to close up at the same time as Southeast Asia, for instance, is opening up, right? And now I think, I suppose my point is that you go back historically, I don't care when you go back, thousands of years, you will find when economies are open, that's when they progress. When they close, that's when they go backwards. Now, to me, this is going to give an impetus to closing, right? And so you'll see some advantage. Like there's not enough meat for China at the moment. But if we balkanise, in the end, China will, if the US helps to balkanise the world, right, we might be talking about some AI, stream of activity. And China might say, well, we'll block your meat if you adopt that US AI system and not our AI system, right? Then we're stuck with a decision. What do we do? But the world is worse off, whatever we decide to do. And look, and so, it's what, the modeling's what I did a commercial modelling for 4 years. That's a long time ago. But I found whatever assumptions I put in, it dictated where I got out. Then I employed companies for 20 years to give me modelling, and my opponents did also. And they came out with different results to mine. But it's what goes into it. And it's my problem with the IPPC too, but that's not for now. I'm not querying you. It could well be that we're better off for a while. Like I know in the meat, because I'm involved heavily in that, we can't find enough meat to satisfy because of what the US has done. But that could change soon. It's more, you've got to look long term. Is this sanctioning something which is materially stupid, right? And is it going to foster more and more action in that regard? He's now put 100% tariff on all our films. Tell me the logic, and what confusion is that causing? And I'm now in a number of projects where we're looking for multi-billions, right? And going to all the big black rocks, all these big ones around the world, now they're saying, until things stabilise, our purse is pretty much closed, right? Or we're doing 10% of what we typically do. So you do that around the world. That's where the impact is on Australia, not on the 10%. Who cares? Yeah, but it's where it's leading to, and I think we've got to make a stand from day one. We've got to say we are not. We don't share. We don't start doing the same thing as they're doing. We take it in the neck sometimes, but we've got to find friends. That's why, I think we should be with the Southeast Asia, saying the TPP and RCEP, the two agreements that really cover most of all the countries, we should to join them as much to show we're looking for, a better free trade outcome, which incorporates all the things that have happened, are happening in the world. But more makes a statement to the US. You can come into this. The architecture allows you to come in, but only if you accept not balkanising the world.
Andrew, Richard Hinks here from Abbott Agribusiness in Sydney here. You talk about Portugal, India, Indonesia, Vietnam and China seem to have a can-do attitude. Have we lost it here? And how do we get it back? Or is it as simple as just getting everyone to watch the latest Mission Impossible movie?
Right. Yeah, actually, I love that show. We haven't lost it. Like the China Free Trade Agreement, we've gone from 98 billion our trade to 330 billion. The US this last year bought 30 billion. We bought 60 billion. We've got nothing. We've got no reason to give 10% because we run a huge deficit on trade, and that's not a problem. If you follow comparative advantage and you open up the world, it all works out. In the end, you've got a deficit with some and a surplus with others, and it works out. But if you start, it's just a nonsense, this stuff. As I said earlier, the deficit he's got is not a function of being done in the eye from trade. And he does mention China, and they have taken advantage of them. But the US have been in there more than any other country. All of their high tech, all of our phones, most of these things, they're all produced, but they're American, but they're produced. So it's very hard to identify even how much the US is, disadvantaged by China. Because if the world, for 20 years, world growth, 2/3 of world growth for the last 20 years has been a function of the growth in China. So China did really well, 800 million out of poverty, and you only have to go there now to see how much is happening. It's just unbelievable. Even in the last 5 years, it's just incomprehensible. They sort of moved a whole new stage, right? All the hundreds of millions who came out of poverty, their kids are better educated than the parents, and they're the ones in the laboratories. Huawei, which we've banned, right? It's got 150,000 young engineers in their R&D operation. 150,000. How are we going to? We're denying ourselves access to. There's no other company in the world in that telecommunications. They got everything from phones to satellites and that whole supply chain. They're number one now in the world, every one of them, right? And the US and ourselves, and we're all said, oh, no. Now, we could have found a way where we took advantage of a lot, but we, denied them some access. I studied this extensively. Because I was in the heart of it, and saying we can have them, but if from a security point of view, we can deny them certain parts of it, right? But no, wham, right? 600 people in R&D from Australia with Huawei out the door. So you see my point, but we are, we've been a part of that growth of the chapter. We have got, our problem is the debt, and it's more a domestic policy issue, and FIRB. I'd say if we open up FIRB more to investment, they're finding some security issue with everything. You want to go bring a new brand of lollies in. Oh, no, you don't. There's some security. There might be lollies in there that are, poisonous. I don't know. It's sort of, I'm being stupid now, but it's reaching that sort of point, and it takes you months, and it costs you $1 million every time you sign up for it. We're an export country. That's what we do. That's why we got this unbelievable quality of life that we've got. We've got to foster it, and our governments are just, the trouble is our security people are joined at the hip with the United States. They're almost, born in the same hospitals. But they've certainly, they've worked together, they play together, they retire together, everything, they go to war together. It's an understandable with the strength of that alliance. And that's the other thing I find, we invest more in the US than they invest in Australia. We've got a $30 billion deficit with the US on trade. We've got so many thousands. I tell you, this is what gets up my nose. We've had our own young people in every theatre of war with the United States for 70 years. We are a partner. We are an alliance partner. We are friends. We trust one another, right? And yet, we've got. I get a lot involved in mental health issues. I see all the time that what a lot of other people don't, and that is thousands of young people who've been in Vietnam, Vietnam for one, but now Afghanistan. You go 5 times to Afghanistan and you come back, you're never the same. So many of them, thousands of them with post-traumatic stress disorder, their lives are finished, but it's not just them, it's their families and all their contacts. Often their lives get trashed for 30 years trying to help and assist, and then half of them kill themselves. And that creates another, generation of guilt amongst all of their family. What could we have done? Now that's the price we paid, and we've agreed to pay it because of the strength of our alliance. And then he comes along and puts 10%, puts 100% on film, right? He puts 35 or 25% on aluminium. And I do not accept it. I do not accept it. This is, intolerable for an alliance partner with the strength that we've got to put up with that sort of total rejection of the significance of a friendship, of an alliance that goes back 70 years. So, there's more to this than just who can buy something and who can sell something.
Here with us, time for one more.
Andrew, Robb, Scott Boover from KWM. You've talked about India before. I'd just be interested on the opportunities for Australian business in India. Where do you see them being?
Okay. It was the negotiation. Look, they've had a history of avoiding opening up, right? And especially their bureaucracy. The bureaucracy has been long-term deeply corrupt, right? And it's a sort of corruption, it's not like getting thousands of dollars, and it might have been, but the biggest one is that, you've got a job and you create 6 more for your relatives, and you're all shifting the same piece of paper 6 times, right? And that's the sort of, so they don't want anything interrupting that. And yet, invariably, they're very smart. They're super smart. I went for years into negotiations, all sorts of different global negotiations or bilateral or whatever, and they'd be at the end of the table, and all the other countries would negotiate all day, reach some outcomes, and right at the end, they would lob something in the middle of the table, having contributed nothing, and they're almost doing high fives. Invariably, it was very smart too. So you're dealing not just with some, second-rater, and so they are frustrated a lot. But lo and behold, along comes Modi. He is an unbelievable. Who can bring in a GST to 1.4 billion when most of them weren't really taxed before? I mean, that's a miracle. I don't know how he did it, but there's so much he's changed. They've now got 7. They've got the first high-speed rails, 500k. Got 7 more in the early stages, right? All sorts of things are happening. It's just amazing. But the year before we ended up signing the agreement in 22, our agricultural trade was $1 billion. The year after was $2 billion, right? Still early days, but the opportunity. They have close to 200 million people who are middle class, right? So there's a lot of poverty still. like there's 300 million people without electricity. There's 70 million without a toilet, right? And then there's another couple 100 million who are part of all that who are below the poverty line. So he's got big challenges, but he's addressing it in all sorts of ways. But they've got almost a billion who are either average or middle class, and so there's an enormous opportunity. I think it does require patience, but with this agreement, there's been a cultural difference. We've been swamped with ministers coming out here, and that really is a sign to everybody there and here. Go for it. So I think it is well worth. That's a lot of our future. A significant part of our future, in my view, is agriculture, but a lot of other things that we do well, right? And Adani went through all that battle with he spent $1 billion over 7 years litigating against all the green groups, really, who were funded from New York and London and everything. But he's got massive. We're getting the amount of taxation returns we're getting from what Adani's taking out each year is unbelievable. So, there's a lot in the resource, because it's very hard for them to dig up resources because there's somebody on top of every piece of ground in India, right? So, again, good relationships and a real opportunity in the future.
Andrew, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for making time for Farm Riders.